School workshop on Introduction to Data Visualization. And just want to introduce our co-facilitators, our colleagues. We're very grateful to have you join us today. We have Brian Votruba from the University Libraries. Brian is the librarian for European Studies, which is German, Nordic, Slavic, Dutch, Jewish Studies, Linguistics, and French and Italian. And we also have Cody Hennessy, also with the University Libraries Computational Research Librarian and Interim Journalism Librarian. So thank you very much, Brian and Cody, for agreeing to do this session for us. We're very excited. And I want to thank Imjan Isteva, who also helped us identify this topic as a very important topic for graduate students and postdocs and help to connect us to Brian and Cody. So I'll have the two of you take over.
Great, thank you, Nora. Hey, everybody. I will do quick introductions before we get started properly. And I'm gonna put in the chat the links to the slides if you want to follow along, but there's no need to open the slides up on your own. There are some links in there, but we'll try to drop links in the chat as we go. But yeah, so my name's Cody. I use he, him pronouns. I'll be leading most of the session, though I designed this with Brian Votruba. Brian, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Votruba. Nuru gave my title European Studies, Linguistics, Jewish Studies Librarian, but I'm glad that there's so many people here. And I'll be handling the chat today. So if any questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat or let me know if you're having any difficulty.
Yep. Yeah, and it's really great to see so many people have showed up. I kind of can see the chat, but I'll sort of let Brian flag me if things are churning there. One thing that might be nice, though, as we're sort of getting started off, is if you could add in the chat just like your department. And maybe if there's a reason you're here, like, what do you want to do with data viz? Are you trying to put a chart in a scholarly paper that you're publishing? Do you need to give a presentation? You don't have to go into great details, but it'd be really cool to just get a sense of why folks are here, what you're hoping to get out of this. And so on the bottom of this first slide, I just wanted to recognize I'm drawing from a couple different sources. So there's an introduction to data visualization from the Carpentries organization that we're using some content from. And then there's also a colleague of ours in the libraries. Shanda Hunt has a slide deck called Tell Your Research Story about visualization design and messaging. And that second one especially, if you're more interested in like creating infographics and the process of how do you match a message to an infographic, that's going to have a lot more on that. And then I'll tell you what this one, what our session today is going to focus on. And do people have access to the chat? Cool. All right, starting to see some stuff. Yeah, it'd be great to hear a little bit of what you're doing. All right, everyone at once. Cool. So the plan today is we're going to really talk about fundamentals of data visualization. And really this means using charts and graphs, creating charts, creating graphs. As a part of that, we're going to look at the importance of a message. So what is your message? Like, why are you creating this? What the sort of content you want to communicate? We'll look at some graphical elements of charts pretty briefly. You know, this will be like a very quick overview with a ton of information. We'll also look at like, how do you choose what types of charts you would want to match with certain kinds of message or certain kinds of data, really. And then at the end, we will have a chance to start to build some charts. And we're going to use Google Sheets for that. I'm going to try to have time, I think we will, for like a little 5-minute break. Yeah, right around 2:45 or so. We'll see where we're at in the session, just so we can sort of walk around, take a bio break if you need. And I did want to mention what we won't cover in case you're like, oh, this is not the workshop I signed up for. You know, that's totally fair. So we're not going to talk about designing infographics. There's actually a third workshop here. So Lattice, who worked with the College of Liberal Arts, had a workshop on designing infographics. And so you can go check that out, that slide deck there, for more information there. We won't be talking about graphic design. I'm not a graphic designer. So I really don't have a good sense of like design tips in that sense. Though we will talk about choices you can make to make your message clearer. We also won't have time. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of data cleaning or preparing your data. So really important before you can visualize anything is to have your data in order. But this won't be a how-to, and like, how do you clean that data? How do you prepare your data in a good way? And then we're not going to really cover, though if you have questions, we can maybe pick those up at the end or along the way. But we're not going to get into advanced software like Tableau. We're not going to use Python or anything like that. We're going to focus, as I mentioned, we're going to use some Google Sheets to generate some charts as we get going at the end there. And then also, so there will be, if folks are interested in getting one of the grad school badges, we're offering a maroon badge for this. So if you stick around for 90% of this Zoom session, you'll get a notification from Canvas that you'll be added to the course, and you can jump in there and take, it's just like a 5-question quiz. And I think we just set it to be due November 30th, and you have a couple chances to take that. And so you can let I'm John know if you have questions about that along the way as well. Cool. So let's dive in a little bit. Let me just scroll through here. Yeah, so people doing presentations, poster presentations, graph plotting techniques, assessments, just general data viz. This is really helpful. Cool, and it's good to hear where everyone is coming from. All right. So also do feel free as we're going, like, to let us know in the chat if you have some question in terms of like, well, you're talking about this, how would it relate to my specific use case? Because I think that can be helpful for everyone. So just keep that in mind, like we can make this interactive as we go, and we'll have a few times where you can do little exercises as well. But so first, some terms, just so we're in sort of the same ballpark of how we're talking about some of this. So a lot of times we talk about data and statistics synonymously. But generally, as you start to work on projects like this, you might want to think about data as just those raw, unanalyzed pieces of information. So I've got a little screenshot from one of the tables we're going to work with at the end, where you've just got a column that represents a variable, a row that represents an observation. It's not telling a story at all. It's not really communicating a message. You have to look at this data to sort of draw that message out. So then statistics are the results of that data analysis, right? So it's interpreted data. You can represent those through charts and graphs, which is what we'll sort of focus on. But you could also just, share those in a sentence. Also, I will pretty much use these synonymously, but charts and graphs are a little bit different. So all graphs are a type of chart, but not all charts are graphs. Basically, charts are visual representations of any data. So the data may or may not be related. It could show how data relates to a story, like in an infographic, whereas a graph is more specifically dealing with numerical data. The data variables that you would deal with there would be related in some way. And this is really what we're going to focus on today. So looking at these different sort of mathematical, statistical, chronological, ordinal relationships between different numerical data. And the purpose of a chart, I added a couple of things here. So ultimately, you want to keep in mind like a chart that you're going to share in a poster session or in a research paper or master's thesis. You want to use a chart to clearly communicate some message. And that message is something that you should be able to also communicate with a sentence, right? But it's going to help sort of illustrate that. That's really important. The charts that we're going to look at, however, at the end of this session, and what you might do when you're first dealing with data, is you can also make charts and graphs and do visualization just to aid your own exploration, to start to see the data in a different way that's easier to sort of examine in a visual way than it is through looking through a bunch of numbers. So keep that in mind. There's the sort of internal use, or just for you and the research team. You might use some of these data viz techniques without a message in mind. But when you're going to publish something, when you're going to share something, you want to think about what is the message. The components of a chart, which I've referred to, first, you're going to have some data that's usually going to be arranged in a table, so a tabular format. There are other ways you could do this, but for the sort of simplest approach, you're going to have this sort of tabular format, so like a Google Sheet, an Excel spreadsheet. I mentioned you want to have some message about the data, and then you're going to have graphic elements. So pretty simple. So let's look at, as we start, some like not as wonderful charts, just to think about like the ways that this stuff can go awry. And so there can be data errors. So in this sense, this person is 243% baby boomer, right? So it's a whole person that's adding up to more than 100%. They probably were, this is representing a survey where you could select all that applied, right? That's a perfectly good way to do a survey, but you can't represent that then as a part of a whole because you have more than 100%. So there's not a clear sort of relationship between 100% of a person and the values represented here. So there's some data errors that can get in the way. And we'll think about how do you choose a chart type that matches your data. So a second example is there going to be an unclear message. And this is actually a chart from a book. I think it was on data visualization. A colleague of mine shared this. So representing mortality in 7 different countries related to COVID-19. And it's a very cool information graphic, but it's pretty hard to get the message away from here, right? This was used as an example of data journalism. And typically, a journalist wants to sort of communicate with the graphic something that can be sort of quickly interpreted and understood. This might be a great chart for a scholarly paper where you're going to have experts coming to it, or like a website that's more interactive and sort of exploratory, or maybe an author or an artist talk related to sort of data visualization. So it's not necessarily that this is a bad chart, but given the context of like data journalism, this might not be the best choice, just because the message is not really clear. Like what the takeaway is, I can't tell you. And then a third example, and this is probably more common in the worlds we're sort of hanging out in. So scholarly paper figure, you might recognize this exact sort of design. So manuscript figures can be difficult because we can assume that our audience has a pretty good understanding. So they're experts in the field. So you can get a more dense chart in that sense. But in this sense, we just can't read. We can't make the comparisons we're supposed to be able to make. So we have 7 series of samples. They're all important here, and we want to show them in some order so we can compare them. But it's just really hard to like follow a single line in this sense. I don't really have to unpack it. I think it's clear that it's hard to read, right? And so in this sense too, this might be a stage where going back to that message is really helpful. If you have 7 different comparisons that you're making, that's likely to be more than one sentence, right? So maybe you want to highlight specific couple series or break this up in some other way to make it more clear. Another thing that's worth noting is that this appears to just be like the default settings for a piece of software that generates data visualizations. We can't rely on those default settings, whether it's like Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets or like a Python package like Matplotlib. We can't rely on them to actually look good or communicate things clearly. Sometimes you have to change those to make better visualizations. All right. So just moving some stuff here on my screen really quickly. All right. So before you want to visualize any data, you do want to make sure that you've prepared it. And there's a couple different terms that we use. So a lot of times people talk about cleaning the data first. And I have a few examples of how you would do that. The goal of clean data is that it's summarizable, it's countable, and it's calculable, right? So you want data formatted in a way that you can get sums and get averages using those data tables. A few things that you almost always want to do, depending on your software to some extent, but it's always a good idea. So like removing white space. So once you start working with data, if there's a space before a number, that might actually be interpreted as meaningful and leave that data out of a count or a sum, right? It might interpret it as a text string instead of a number. So you want to be careful about that white space. You want to address any outliers or nulls or missing data or empty cells, and there are best practices for how you do this. Often though, you don't want to just put a 0. Like if someone didn't respond to a survey question that was a question about like ranking something from 0 to 10, you wouldn't want to represent a lack of a response as a 0, because 0 has meaning once you start working with that data, right? Another thing that we do that's really common, like when I'm just working with a spreadsheet on my own, is I'll format things. Like I'll put things in bold, or I'll put a row in a certain color that has some meaning to me. That doesn't have any meaning once you start sort of working with the data. So if you have formatting that has meaning that you need to be able to work with, you want to make sure you put that in a column in some way and represent it, right? And we'll look a little bit more at that as we go. There's this second concept, tidy data, which is a little more specific, but it's looking at basically these 3 concepts. So not only should you, do the clean data, but you also want to just make sure that your columns represent your variables, your rows represent your observations, and you have one value per cell. So if you start to put stuff together in a single cell, like if someone could respond to a survey and check all that apply, and you have multiple responses in one cell, it's going to be really hard to work with. And so there's different ways that you can do that depending on your software, but just conceptually, keep in mind you want to have one value per cell. Any questions about what we have so far? It should be fairly straightforward. We're going to start looking at some specifics now.
There are no questions in the chat.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at just the role of tables. And so a table, I mentioned, is necessary for making a chart. It's not going to be a substitute for a chart, but sometimes tables are so clear that that's a better visualization than visualizing it, right? Like if you look at the numbers in a couple columns and it's really easy for you to say, I can tell what the message is here, you don't need to do anything else. But let's take a minute and actually let's use the chat for this. So just take a look at this chart, and I think it's pretty clear what we're looking at. We have average monthly temperature on the left, and we have the daily walks per dog on the right-hand column. So just think about this for a second. How easy or difficult is it for you to understand this? What patterns can you detect? And so maybe just think about it. Maybe write your answer to the second question, what patterns you can detect, in the chat, and then don't submit for a second. So we'll give you 30 seconds to look at this. I think by the time I got my stopwatch on my phone app open, it's probably been about 15, 30 seconds. So we might be getting there. Go ahead and plug into the chat. Like, did you think this was easy or difficult? What's the sort of pattern that pops out? Yeah, a little bit hard to connect, higher temp, more walks, no dog walks on the coldest days. Totally. Yep. Yeah, exactly. This last comment, like it is easy to see the variables, but it's a little hard to see the patterns. Totally. So this, like a table isn't a great visualization for this. So we could imagine just charting this, basically moving a table to a chart. Usually there are other ways that you can do it, but you would want to map this stuff on a Cartesian plane where we have our y-axis, our vertical axis, and our x-axis is our horizontal axis. And we're going to map the different variables to this in different ways. So here's that table where we're looking at the daily number of walks that a dog gets on that y-axis, and we have the average monthly columns in the x-axis. So I would ask the same question here. Like we already sort of have looked at the data, so we know what the patterns is, but maybe just add in the chat, like, do you find this particularly easy to read or difficult? Are there any like challenges with this or any changes you would make? And you can just type it right into the chat as you go. Yeah, I agree. It's pretty easy. There's one like change I would make maybe. Yeah, why are the values on the x-axis not consecutive? So that's a good question. And I think there's a way to fix it. Have the temps in order. The numbers of degrees are weird. They are weird. The x-axis is a little weird. Can anyone sort of figure from the label what the x-axis represents? So the x-axis is actually, yeah, the months of the year. It's like the average temperature per month. Exactly. I would do what Patrick recommends here. Put the month names along with the average temperature would probably make it a little easier to tell. Or if the story you're telling, like if the message is that dogs don't get walked on cold days and they don't get walked on hot days, there might be a completely different visualization that you do that doesn't sort of plot this in the same way. Maybe it's an infographic, maybe it's a sentence, you know. Cool, thanks for taking a look at that. So the chart message, though, generally is the relationship between the elements that emerge when X is plotted against Y. So that's where the message of your chart is going to come out. Okay. So later in this lesson, we're going to look at a data set about wolves and coyotes and foxes. And so just to like hammer on this message a little bit more before we get into the graphic elements, this is an area where sort of populations of different canids, they're called, has real public policy sort of implications. And so the way that you would communicate the results of a study showing wolf populations, for example, could really help you connect with government officials, the general public, and others who might sort of scientists and folks who would have some sort of impact on what happens going into the future, right? We're not going to like dig deeply on all of these, but just to give you a sense of like, there are some fundamental graphics and visual properties that you can work with. There are other ways that you could slice and dice this, but I think, and the reason that I want to share this is next we're going to look at which kinds of these elements are the easiest for people to quickly understand. So we'll talk about what make for better charts and worse charts, clearly in terms of like what's easier for someone to quickly read. So graphic elements, we've got points, so like scatter plot, dots. You have lines, which we just saw, a line chart, areas, so like a 2D shape, and volume, so something that's sort of gone 3D. And then with most of these, you can do different things in terms of visual properties. You can position them somewhere on that XY axis. You can align them to different scales, like we saw that monthly scale and the number of walks scale. There's different lengths and directions and angles, the size, the curvature, shading, and color, and so on. So don't need to like describe these too much, except to start to think about what makes for better or worse graphics. And so keep in mind too, there is an art to data visualization, and what we're going to be talking about is not the sort of art of infographics and data visualization. We're going to be more talking about the science of it. So just like what's easier for people to perceive accurately. That's the whole thing we're focused on. And we're drawing from a couple studies, one from 1984, Cleveland and McGill. And that title, I'm just going to look, it's Graphical Perception, Theory, Experimentation, and Application to the Development of Graphical Methods. So some statisticians who did this work. And they're essentially looking at these different graphical elements and visual properties in terms of better visualizations, which mean they're easier to perceive accurately, or worse, which just means they're more difficult to perceive accurately. Okay. And so they did find, sorry, I forgot to talk about the points here. So a couple things. Points are better than lines. Generally, the sort of overall theme is that the simpler, the better. So points are easier to see than lines or understand. Lines are better than areas, so two-dimensional shapes, and areas are better than volume, so those three-dimensional shapes. If we get into it a little bit more and combine those graphical elements with different visual properties, points do well when they're positioned on a common scale, and they are worse when they're positioned on non-aligned scale. Lines, when they have specific length, direction, and angles, that's all good and pretty easy to perceive. When you start to bring in curvature, so curving those lines, becomes harder for people to sort of understand. And if you think back to that graph that was all these sort of spiraling COVID things, that curvature is actually a little hard to just read and understand quickly. You could do it, but it's just going to take some like cognitive work there. Shapes, area is better than volume, right? So don't go to 3D unless you really have to, essentially. Shading and color gets pretty complex, but some better uses would be to use color to differentiate categories or other non-numeric data using a graduated scale or contrasting colors. So basically to highlight things that might be labeled otherwise, or to help you see differences along a sort of scale, right? Also just to draw attention to areas of the chart that are most closely aligned essentially with your message, right? So maybe you have a line graph, but a few points of that line graph are really where you want to draw people's attention. Maybe color is a tool you can use there. So some worse uses for color is to use similar colors. It's just hard to see, right? And also to just choose too many colors. So fewer colors is often better. Also having no clear reason to use a color. I'll often just use grayscale when I generate like a chart for a scholarly paper that I'm working on or doing research. It's also helpful to think about like, how will this image be reproduced? Is it going to be printed in print? If so, is it going to be a color printout? So that's also why grayscale can be really good. Grayscale avoids issues with color blindness or visual perception. So making sure it's accessible to different people with different visual sort of background. So accessibility is another good thing to think about that we won't dive into much here today. And then you might also just think about like, what assumptions are my colors making for the viewer as well. And so one tool that I'd recommend, one second, take a drink. All right, so one tool, this is actually sort of built for doing cartographic sort of mapping work, but it works really well for coming up with color schemes that we'd use for any data visualization. It might be a little hard to see from this, but on the left-hand side, it allows you to say how many data types do you have, data classes. So you can choose those. You can say, what's the nature of your data? Is it sequential? Is it qualitative? Is it diverging? And then it'll give you different color schemes based on that. You can also choose, does it need to be print friendly, colorblind safe? And you can sort of choose from some different options within there. So that can be really helpful to sort of work with. And then it gives you these sort of color codes that you would take and put into whatever software tool you're using. Okay. So that was a lot of information very quickly. Apologize for that. But let's sort of check in and just look at a few charts. And so these might sometimes be trickier, but just take a minute to look at these three and let's sort of put in the chat, but don't submit it yet. Just like, what do you think is the clearest chart? So what's the best of these three charts? That are all trying to communicate the same message. I don't know what the message is for these, which is not ideal. But just based on what we talked about, these graphical elements, the visual properties, which of these three do you think is the best? Cool, yeah, we've got some people saying A. And then what about the worst? We might have some diverging opinions. What's the worst of these? Got some B's and C's. Yeah, so according to those properties, just because this B has that 3D sort of volume, you can see the axes are sort of turned and it's trying to show you the sort of depth of these lines. B would actually be the worst of these because a 3D line chart, yeah, exactly. 3D sort of distorts it. It doesn't tell you anything about this data. It's a little harder to read. But this one too, the 2D area chart, probably unnecessary when just couple lines would do. So again, this is just saying lines are better than area is better than volume. Okay. So another one here. So let's say, well, let's do the worst first. go ahead and say, what is the worst of these three charts? So they're trying to depict parts of a whole here. All right, so this one's totally counterintuitive. Yeah, we've got a C question mark. So according to just those elements we looked at, C is actually the best, because it's just giving us a bar chart. So we're dealing with sort of a line, essentially, that's showing us the parts of a whole. When you bring in this circle in the area, supposedly it becomes a little more harder to read. I think in practice, we're so used to looking at pie charts for parts of a whole that for me, that A is very easy to read. So I would say A is a totally easy one. C, though, according to like these rules, is also easy. Again, though, this 3D pie chart is chosen as the worst. I think it's not that hard to read, but that 3D thing just makes it harder, totally unnecessary. I guess if there's any takeaway, like never make your charts 3D. That's sort of the main thing. Okay, any questions about that? Yeah, and Brian has a point. There might be different expectations for where you're putting this, right? I think a pie chart would probably be more accepted in like a newspaper, certainly, and would probably be used in a lot of scholarly papers. But you might see in some scientific research C showing up more often, right? If folks are really into this sort of stats side of things. Okay. So let's take a look at some of these data types. So these are the kinds of data that are underlying, that are in these tables that can help us choose specific charts that we're going to work with. And let me just finagle some things around again here. Okay. So there are different ways of saying different data types. So different like data science people will describe like 14 different unique types. We're going to keep things very simple. This is sort of an intro level. And we're just going to think of these discrete, continuous, or categorical data types. So discrete data are data that can take on a limited range of values. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Say those are the ratings that you give an album, right? You can either get a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. There's no other values. So it's a discrete number. So you can get like 4 out of 5 star ranking. Continuous generally would be like any number of values. So 0, 1, 2 on to infinity. In practice, though, anything more than about 30 discrete values moves into the continuous level. So you could think about like the distance from Earth to different stars. That's continuous. It's not, infinite, but there's enough values there that it's not really discrete. You could even think of like the heights of different humans as being continuous. You're not going to deal with many like 12 feet tall people, but there are enough discrete ranges there that we have more than 30 values. So in practice, we want to think about these as continuous data types. And then we have categorical, or these are often like qualitative values, right? So different categories. So a data type might be like, what kind of animal is it? Is it a dog, cat, a turtle, a human? You'll often see these in different clinical trials in terms of like vaccine versus placebos, and so on. Like if you were looking at agriculture, you might think of, is it a fertilized crop or unfertilized, would be a categorical data type. And so now moving from data types into some chart types, and then what we'll do next is actually start to map some of these together. So very broadly, before we look at some of these specifically, there are chart types that can be good for just comparing different categories or individuals. So like a bar chart or a line chart, which we've looked at so far. So before we saw the temperature outside, we're comparing the temperature outside to the number of walks that a dog gets. So we're comparing two different variables there. Next, we have these composition. So again, you can deal with single or multiple variables here, but you're looking at pie charts, stack charts to give us a sense of, like, for example, if we think about those album ratings, like the percentage, you could map a bunch of album ratings to say what percentage of albums have received a 4 out of 5 rating at a certain music website, right? So you might use a composition to sort of map those 5 different possibilities. A distribution chart you would use to look at a single variable. And you would use something like a histogram or a scatter chart, which we'll look at those in a minute if those are unfamiliar. But this would be, for example, you could look at how many people attended a workshop by date, right? And so you'd say you had 12 different workshops, and you might plot those over time on a scatter chart, so where they're each sort of dots on an X and Y axis, and then you could use that to sort of map a line through. So the distribution of that, those attendance over time. Or relationships. So these are a little more complex. You're less likely to use these sort of bubble charts. But this is just doing a similar thing to the distribution, but you're looking at a relationship between 2 or more variables. So if you were talking about how many people attended a workshop, you would need a second variable, like how many reminder emails did they receive before the workshop? And then that might be a bubble chart where you have a couple different variables that you're trying to map. And so let's look at some of these specific ones. So bar chart, I think we're all familiar with. So this is comparing quantities of related data categories to each other. So we could look at, and I should mention all of these I took from UNLV has a data viz guide with a lot of good examples. So we're just looking, this chart shows the types of computers in US households in 2021. It's from the US Census Bureau, where you're basically like each bar is a type of computer. So like a desktop or laptop is in red, a smartphone is in green. So pretty easy to compare those categories together. You're just saying how many millions of each of these items do people have across the United States. A line chart is helpful when you're tracking the development of multiple variables over time. You can do that. You can use it for other things, but usually these are time plots that you're doing. So in this case, we're looking at the age at the time of giving birth in the US. It's actually a slightly weird chart. The green line at the bottom represents people who are between the ages of 15 and 19 years. So then we're plotting the number of births that there have been from like 2010 to 2021. Looking at this chart, I think folks can see it more or less. It might be a little small. And thinking about the graphical elements and stuff, I'm curious, like, what might you change about this chart, or what is difficult about this chart? There's more than one thing, I think, but did anyone sort of suggest anything here to improve the chart? Y-axis is a little hard to read. Yeah, I think the scale, so you could see the differences. They almost all look flat to me. That would be like my main thing. Yeah. To me, the story, like if you think about the message here, maybe your message is births went down for people who are 15 to 19 years old. Or maybe your message is related to births went up for people who are 35 to 50 years old. But that's pretty hard to see here. Maybe we just cut off the top. Like we could change that scale and just only go up to 1.5 million births, and we'd probably get a better look at those two categories, right? All right, so pie chart, again, displaying parts of a whole. I don't think we need to like dig into that. That one's pretty clear. Stacked area chart is to track changes in groups of data over time, showing a part to whole relationship. And I would say these are pretty dangerous. So in this case, we're looking at the number of first bachelor's degree fields in the US in 2021. And on the y-axis, we have the number in millions of degrees for specific large fields, right? So this bottom, we have science and engineering. This red is science and engineering related. The yellow is business and so on. is there anything here that's like makes it a little hard to tell, sort of read the message for you? There is the general message of like, okay, we went from 65-ish million degrees up to about 80 million. So we see that sort of top level is all the different degrees. Are there any challenges for you in sort of parsing the rest of this message? And this isn't really one we've explicitly talked about. Shading under each line. Yeah, some lines being flat, fraction of the whole, totally. All of these things. So for me, like, it's clear that this bottom, the science and engineering degrees went up, but I can't tell the red, the science and engineering related, or the business, are those all flat, but they're just going up because the science and engineering went up, right? So are they just turned on an angle, but they're actually not increasing? So it's a little hard to read. Stacking makes one wonder if you read from the bottom all the way to the top. Yeah, I think you do start from the bottom, and then it's a little tough to read this thing, right? Yeah, it's just a little harder to work with. So histograms can be mistaken for just like a regular bar chart. But what you're doing with a histogram is displaying the distribution of frequencies over specific intervals. So in this case, we're looking at the age at the time of marriage in the US, and the frequencies over intervals is we're saying we're going to choose, all individuals have a single age, right? You're 34 years old, you're 45 years old, whatever. You fall into a certain category, but we've created these buckets to say we're going to lump all the 15 to 24-year-olds together, and we're going to graph that. We're going to put all the 25 to 34-year-olds together and graph that, right? So you're showing this distribution of different ages to make those comparisons of groups that you're sort of creating. If you had people fill out a survey and just say, I'm between 15 to 24 years old, I'm between 25 to 34 years old, it wouldn't really be a histogram. It's a histogram when you're taking individual data variables and you're putting them in your own sort of buckets and making that choice of how to divide them up, to plot them. Does that make sense? Okay, and we mentioned scatter plots before. So this is to show correlations between two quantitative variables. So this is also like a slightly weird example. We have marriage and age correlation, where age is our x-axis, except we only have these specific ages: 15, 20, 35, 45, 55, 65. That's a little odd to me. If it's from the US Census Bureau, I don't know what happened to everyone who has other ages or where they showed up. But this is for, you know, the number of married people in the millions at each of these specific points. So this might be a better plot if you had, you know, a much smaller sample size. If you had a survey of 30 people and you put their specific ages against this, it would be a more sensible plot. And then the reason you do this often is to sort of plot this line to look at how do they correlate? Is it generally rising or falling? Okay, so we've come, actually, this is like a perfect time to take a break. I am going to actually put this in the chat. Let's see if I can copy it. I might have to leave this to display really quickly. I'm gonna put this link here. So if you want to see this big image, you can go there. It might be a little easier to read. We're not gonna dig into this, but we talked a little bit about how you choose a specific chart to go with specific data that you have. This flowchart tries to walk you through that. So do you have 2 variables per item and you're trying to compare categories, then sort of go through and look at that. So you start with these sort of broad categories. Are you doing a comparison? Are you trying to make a relationship? Show the composition of a whole, the distribution. You sort of go out from that based on the flowchart. Again, we're not going to use that today, but if you want to go to that URL that I put in the chat, you can use that or print it out for later. And what we are going to do in just a minute, I'll show you there are some other resources. So I mentioned these different slide decks. You can go to that. There are ways that you can get help. I wanted to show you this. We have more of the workshop, but I wanted to show you this because we might not come back to the slides. You can always email me for help, probably email Brian as well. Brian can put his email in there if he wants. Lattice, if you're in CLA, is a good place for quantitative support and qualitative support doing data visualization. The libraries also have research data services who can help out, and these are links. So if you're in the slide deck, you can use those to get to all of these. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go into Google Sheets and start to play with some data. And so let's first take, about 5 minutes. So let's come back at about let's actually come back at 5 till 3 in the Midwest time. So let's take like an 8-minute break, and we'll come back at 5 till, and then we'll start to play with Google Sheets. And I am going to take a brief break. I'm John. I don't know if you're sticking around, but I'll be back in a few. Welcome back, everybody. If you're in the Twin Cities, I hope you went outside for 5 minutes. It's pretty pleasant out. It's like 60 degrees. So maybe I'll give folks another minute after everyone's back, but I will put in the chat this data sheet. And so what we're going to do, I'll walk you through this, but you're going to go to this Google sheet. You can be logged in with your university Google account or a personal Google account. It doesn't really matter. You will need to log into Google though to use this. So I hope that's accessible to everyone. We should have mentioned that ahead of time. So just sign into either Google account and go to this spreadsheet, which we'll look at in a second, and then go to File and then make a copy. And while you're doing that, and so you're just going to have a copy of this on your own Google Drive, and then that's what we're going to work with. And so while you're doing that, I'll leave the slide up, but just to describe what this data is, I have the link. It's from this specific Dryad repository for data. And again, this is looking at those wolves and coyote and fox populations, and it's looking at fur return data, so how much fur they can find in these different jurisdictions, different plots of land in North America, to look at whether and how the presence or absence of wolves caused shifts in coyote and red fox density. And so then making arguments from that. So this is not data I'm deeply familiar with, but it's a nice little data set to start to just do some charts as we go. And for this section, we'll be wrapping up by 3:30. I don't think it'll take that long, but I will note there are likely to be some speed bumps here where you're getting different results than I am. So we'll try to go really slowly, ask questions in the chat, let us know when things like aren't quite adding up or if you missed a step as we go. So I am going to leave this slideshow behind and hop over. And so if you are not here, let me look at the chat again. Cool. So I put that data to copy. So go to that link and you should make it here. It looks like a lot of people are here. And then you want to go up to File, make a copy if you haven't done that yet. And I will say you can just watch this part, but it's going to be better for you if it's sort of meant to be hands-on. So it's not going to be the most exciting thing to watch. I'm just going to choose where I put this in my drive. That's what I'm doing now. Don't worry about this. I'm just going to say, put it right in my main drive. Okay, and I'm just going to keep it called copy of intro to data viz, so it's clear which is which. And that should just take a second. And so just to look at this a little bit before we start to play with it. So this is a tidy data set in terms of, if you can recall, you want to have every column represent a variable. So you don't want to like put more than one variable into a specific column. And a really good representation of this is this question of like, is there evidence of a wolf being present or not? And they just say no wolf or wolf. It's like a binary option. You can do one or the other. Similar, where there are basically each row as an observation corresponds to a block, which is like a geographic space, you know, sort of neighborhood out in nature, and a year, right? And so the years can repeat over time, but if you scroll down, you start to see them increase. So this is data that goes over the course of different time. And then you've got, you know, the number of coyotes, the number of foxes, whether or not a wolf is present, so on. They're also doing some calculations here. So it's not entirely clean data or tidy data, because usually something like this, you would save, this is part of the analysis. So this isn't really data. You've already done a calculation here. It's fine to share that if that's a good way to do it. But often you would just use the observed data itself, sort of raw data, as your data set. But regardless, let's start to work with this. And so why don't you just add in the chat like a thumbs up or a looks good if you are in your own copy of the data, just so I know that folks are there. If you need more time, tell me I need more time, or just hold on or something. Okay, I'm not seeing any like signs of issues. Cool. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert a chart, and maybe some of you have done this before. I'm actually going to just click on, can be nice to all be at the same starting point. So just click on this cell A1 ID. We're going to like discard this later, but when you insert a chart, it actually makes a difference what you have selected. So if we all have the same thing selected, we shouldn't get into too much too many diverging paths. Go up to insert. Let me know. I can zoom in a little bit on this so folks can see. Does that look all right? Oh, got a little bit big. So we're going to go to insert and we're going to choose chart. And then I'm going to have to zoom out, I think, at some point because I want to be able to show you some different things. But so now we just have this blank area where our chart is going to appear. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to look at the numbers of coyotes over time in these different areas. And so to do that, let's change the chart type from column to a line chart. And strangely, it doesn't give you like just the names of them. It shows you these different options. Smooth line chart, which we've learned curves are bad, right? So we don't want to do a smooth line chart. We just want to choose a plain line chart. Okay. So go ahead and do that. And then what we want to do first is choose our x-axis. And it automatically puts in this A1 because that's what we selected. So we want to change that. So if you scroll down, you might not see it, but right here we have this x-axis header. And we want to hit the 3 dots over here next to A1. And let's say we're going to remove that. That is not our x-axis. Okay. And then to add a new one, if you come down here, there's this little 4 little squares. And then if you hover, it says select a data range. So that's what we want to do. So you click in the add x-axis box, hit select a data range. And we want to have years as our x-axis, right? Our horizontal axis. We want to plot the number of coyotes over time. And so the way to do that is click into this select a data range pop-up. And you should just be able to click on the F column. And mine fills in here, raw data, exclamation point, F to F. And I'm going to put that in the chat in case you have an issue clicking on stuff. That's the data range you want when you're adding an x-axis. And I'm going to say, okay. Just want to move at a pace to make sure people are keeping up. All right, and nothing is here yet because we haven't said what we want to plot. So we haven't actually chosen our y-axis or our data that we're going to put. But you should now see the year next to under x-axis. And if you scroll down, the way to add your data is we're going to say which series. So each of these variables could be a series that we want to plot along the y-axis. So we're going to say add a series, and we'll use that same little select a data range tool. And make sure you click inside of that. And then we're going to choose column B. So I'll put that in the chat too in case you need to copy and paste it in. And so now we have plotted something, but it looks weird. So let me know, how about give me a thumbs up or a looking good if you have something in your plot that looks like mine. This is not the plot we want to end up with, but let me know. And also let us know if you do not. If you have a plot that looks really different, let us know. And there's no problems if you have a different one. I've gone back on Google Sheets and had like a lot of issues, so seems like people are mostly there. Okay. So it looks like our line chart is like jumping weirdly all over the place. Does anyone know like why this might be based on the data? I can move this over a little bit, I think. This is not something we've covered, but does anything pop out that's like slightly weird about what we're looking at? Yeah, the repeated years, totally. So because we're dealing with these rows where each the number of coyotes. We can have multiple numbers of coyotes in these different plots for the same year. What we need to do is aggregate our counts of coyotes by year. So the way to do that, Google makes it pretty easy. Under x-axis, you should see year, and then there's a little aggregate button. And so if you choose aggregate, it's pretty cool. Like our plot now looks like a plot. And it gives us different options for how do we want to aggregate this. So the default is just going to add them up. So it would add up all the coyotes. But we might say a more accurate way to visualize this is let's look at the average. So you can change that, and then it should change down here, where we're now looking at the average number of coyotes per year across all of these different geographic regions. And so you can actually see a pretty clear message here in terms of like how many coyotes they're encountering over time from 1982 to 2011. We've got some different peaks, right? How are people doing? Do people see this? Did anything go awry there? This is going more smoothly than I thought. I think we're going to have some time for questions at the end, but we are going to plot some more. Cool. When Brian and I ran through this, we had a lot more problems, but it probably reflects that it was good that we ran through it. Okay. So now let's add another plot. So this does tell us a little bit about coyotes. There's not a ton of other data that we could plot against this, but since we have a fox column, let's add that as a second series. And so the way to do that, you can probably guess, right? We're going to go back to series. We're going to say add a series. We'll hit that added data range, select this box. You should just be able to click on that. Column C, we'll put it in the chat. Every once in a while, I've had problems when I'm using Google Sheets in terms of how I click on things and if they show up or not. All right, so something weird happened. Can anyone tell, and probably this is the same for everyone, why did everything get so weird? Are there just way more foxes than coyotes? You want to put in the chat what we need to change here to make this more accurate. Yeah, totally. So the foxes, the default apparently, every time you do this and you're aggregating by year and you add a new series, it's going to switch it over to sum apparently. I think you can come back here though and change all of the series at once. So if you were working with like a lot of different variables, you could add all of the series, don't worry about changing it one at a time, and just come back and say, actually, I want these. They should all be the same, right? If you're going to compare them. And so now you do start to see a pretty nice story in terms of like, well, how did these coyote populations reflect the fox? And it seems like they sort of go together frequently, right? So we know a little bit here. Oh yeah, how do we add a series again? No problem. So to add a series, you might need to scroll down. So it's under x-axis and series, and then there's this add series kind of button. You click on that. From there, it'll show you the data you've already selected, but we just want to do a new one. So we're going to say select a data range, click on that, and then you'll choose the column header. And this is another reason that having your data in that tidy data format, where every column represents a variable, is really helpful, because all you need to do is select that column to say, I want to map it as a series, right? Any questions about that so far? I'm going to do a few other things just to look at Google Sheets and some of how the underlying data relates to charts. But any other questions? Okay, so one thing that is helpful for me when I work with charts, I'll often work with a chart when I'm first putting it together in this default display where it's sort of hovering over my data. But usually that becomes very irritating over time. And so the way to get this out of the way, the best way I think, is you hit these little 3 dots that are in the top of your chart, and you can move it to its own sheet. And then you should see down at the bottom, we have these like sheet tabs. And so it's created a chart here for me. And this is the same chart we just created. If you want to get back and re-edit the chart, you'd go over here and you see that same chart editor feature. And note that there's other things we can do. We can, right now, it's already finding the correct headers. So it's labeled the Coyote and Fox for us. If it wasn't, you can check off use row 1 as headers. So it's worth exploring some of these options. You can then go into customize and choose all sorts of different options in terms of colors, size of the font, what you show on the x-axis, what you show on the y-axis, and so on. We're not going to do too much there, but do take some time to explore this stuff. It can be really helpful. And again, note, these default colors might not be accessible. They might not be publication friendly. They might not follow best practices. And I see Robert said you missed that, and I'm guessing you missed how I moved the chart into a sheet. Is that right? Yeah. So I don't know if I can get this back. Let me see something. Once you move it to a sheet, is it stuck in a sheet? Might be, but I will show you this. So if you were here and you had, don't copy me now, but say you had a chart like this, the way to move it to a sheet is you choose those 3 little dots and you say move to own sheet. So you have the chart sort of hovering. If you click on that, there should appear these 3 dots that give you some options to do things with it, and you want to move it to its own sheet. Cool. So I'm going to delete that chart because that doesn't have anything in it. So we've got this chart over here. How are folks doing? Anyone having any other issues? Miss anything?
I was just gonna tell people, if you delete the sheet, then the chart goes away.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
So don't do that if you want to.
Yeah, so if you're down here,
Right.
the sheet is now synonymous with the chart. So if you delete the sheet, the chart's gone. Yeah. Yeah, good point. And there are some options you can do. You can download it in these different formats. These are not ideal also. I'll note, as someone who has used Google Sheets and then tried to publish some of this stuff from Google Sheets, PNGs, PDFs, and SVGs are not usually what publications want in terms of format. So you have to do a little bit of tinkering to work with that. If you use something like Tableau, or you're using Python, or even Excel, you have more options in terms of how you output this stuff and the quality of the output. That said, you can work with this, and if you have questions about how to do that, I can walk you through some ways you can do it with free software. Does creating a sheet copy the data over to that sheet as well? Yes, good question. So this sheet is called raw data. You can duplicate the sheet, in which case you then have 2 copies of the raw data. For some reason, it's not duplicating. Oh, there we go. So these are unattached to each other then. So if you make an edit over to the copy of raw data, so I'll just like delete a whole column, you can see the raw data is unchanged. So that really is like a copy that you can work with. Another practice we didn't talk about, but when you're doing data visualization, you should never edit your raw data. Ideally, you would never have raw data in a Google Sheet. You would have it living on a specific machine somewhere. You might make a copy of it into Google that you then work with. You always want to keep this raw data unchanged. So a good practice is, if you need to make some changes, you would copy it and then delete columns and stuff like that, right? Just because it can be hard to get back. You might need something here from later. Good question, though. I hope I answered it. Let me know if you didn't, if you were wanting to talk about something else there. Any other questions? So let's do a couple more things with this chart. I'm going to just delete this to get it out of my way. Okay. So I do want to show you the relationship of the chart and the raw data, which we're using to map it. So if you look at this, go back to the raw data sheet, and if you choose the top row, and then you go up to data, and you say create a filter. I don't know if you've done this before. It's really helpful in Google Sheets. And what it does is it gives you a little drop down that's represented by these 3 green lines next to every column header. And when you look at these, you have different options. So it just gives you an easy way to sort by that or to filter different values out or in. So for example, this study was about like whether a wolf is present or not and its relationship with the coyotes and fox populations. So what we could do is go to wolf present, column G, choose the drop down, and let's uncheck no wolf, and then say okay. So what we're going to do is basically look at a subset of the data that only shows us the rows where a wolf is present. And then if you come over to the chart, and if you say edit chart, there's an important thing over here. There's a checkbox that says, do you want to include hidden or filtered data? And if you check that, you can see the chart changes quite a bit, because what we've done is the unchecked version does not include the hidden and filtered data. So what we're seeing right now is a chart of the coyote and fox counts when there is a wolf present. So what you could do using Google Sheets is you might say, oh, I want to download this chart. You could even say, let's edit it. And if you go to customize, you could put in a title and say coyotes and foxes with a wolf present, right? You don't all have to do this, but just want to give you an example. And then you could download that, right? And say, this is my image of the filtered data with a wolf present. You'd want to be careful if you add a title, because if you change the underlying data to say include hidden and filtered data, that title hasn't changed. So now it's incorrect, right? So you just want to pay attention to that. So I'm just going to delete the title. So we can also come back, I'm going to get out of this editor, to our data. And just to look at the difference, we could say, let's also filter and just look at a specific site. So let's just look at Saskatchewan. So we'll uncheck Manitoba. We'll say okay. And then if we come back to that chart, it's probably easiest if we look at that edit chart so that we make sure we're not including the hidden data, right? So we're looking at just that sort of filtered version where we're seeing there's a wolf present and they're in Saskatchewan. So this sort of subsetting the data just in the visualization without changing the underlying data, right? Because over here, the data is still there. You can come back and change this view to like add Manitoba. So that's just to start to give you a sense of the relationship between the underlying data table and how you're going to sort of chart and graph some of that. Just have 12 minutes left. That was pretty much what I was planning to go over. But what questions do people have? Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Did you have any issues with the Google Sheets data or creating the chart? Seems like folks are doing all right. Feel free to unmute too.
Would you mind just doing a run through? You showed us like if we filtered no wolf and then we did that graph and then added a title. Can we do that where like show us doing multiple with different titles? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So let's start with our data sheet. And I am going to say let's just look at Manitoba. I think there are fewer Manitobas. So I'm going to only check Manitoba, uncheck Saskatchewan. And let's keep this to say the wolves are present. And so it's probably helpful if you're going to do this workflow to like note what you're looking at before you go back to the chart. So Manitoba, wolves are present. I'm going to come over here. It's really changed the view of what we're looking at. For one thing, we've just got way fewer smaller averages, right? So it's clear there are fewer samples from Manitoba. Once we're here, if you go into edit chart, we're making sure we have this unchecked. So we're not including the whole data set. I'd come over to customize, chart title, and you would want to make sure you name what's there. One second. Sneeze. Excuse me. Okay. So you would say coyotes and foxes with a wolf present in Manitoba. It's not the most catchy title, right? So we've got that, and this is what we're representing. You can style these things, change fonts and stuff. And then I would just go, okay, I'm going to download that chart. Download it as like a PNG file. It's just an image file. And you could also probably title the download in a way that is easy for you to know what that chart is. And I think actually it puts the title in as your default chart title. So that's pretty nice. Or as your default file name. So you'd save that, right? So we've got that there. Then if you wanted to continue editing that, what I would do, just to be careful, is delete that title now, come back to my raw data, and let's keep Manitoba, but let's say, what does it look like when a wolf is not present? So we're unchecked wolf, and we'll check no wolf. So now the data should look significantly different. It does. If we go into edit chart, scroll down, make sure we're not including that hidden data. Go over and customize this. So I need to remind myself, we're looking at still Manitoba, but with no wolf, right? And so we'll add the title, coyotes and foxes in Manitoba with no wolf present. And then I would just go up and download that one as well. Cool. Oh yeah. Go ahead,
There are
Gar.
a couple other questions, Cody.
Yeah. So let's see. If charts from Google aren't in the required format, why use it at all? You don't have to use it, but I would say almost every piece of software I've used doesn't exactly match the required format. Every publication has a different requirement. Sometimes color accessibility is of more or less importance. I would say the reason to use Google Sheets is because it's easy to use and it's accessible. And the way it's also not that hard to change colors. So just to give you an example, so if we close that title and we go into series, you can change here, I believe, maybe not under series, might be under, oh, you choose a specific series. So I want to choose coyote, and I would choose my colors here that I want, right? Or you can do a custom color there as well. And so you could change that to be more accessible colors. You can use hexadecimal codes, which is what we saw on that color picker. And so that, it looks like, is the next question in terms of colors. And I could look at that. Let's take a quick look. Might take me a second to get there. And does that answer your question? Yeah, it looks like. Great.
And I actually have a related question. Is there a way
Okay.
in Google Sheets to just change it to grayscale
Yeah, I think you just
automatically?
I don't know about automatically. I think so in this case, it doesn't give you the option because you're looking at lines. I think if you
Okay.
have like a what's it called? You know, a stacked bar chart with gradations, I think there is a way to choose scale there. And basically where you just say from black to white, right?
Okay, thanks.
So we'd have to look at that. So from Color Brewer, so we would say we have 2 data classes. It's only letting me do 3. We would say these are diverging maybe because we just really want to show the difference between the coyotes and the foxes in this case. We can say, let's do colorblind safe and print friendly. Didn't seem to make much of a difference. And then we just choose the one we like the best. So these are not far off the sort of red and blue, right? So, and it's giving us these hexadecimal numbers. So usually you can copy that, come back over here, and I think you type it in here in Google Sheets. I'll show you that again. So you go to line color, down under custom, there's the plus button. And then you can just like scroll around and grab one, or you can paste in that hexadecimal figure. And so then we'd come back over here, we'll do it again with this sort of greenish blue. And we say plus, and then we paste that one in. Actually, what we've done is we're still looking at the coyote, so let's change this to fox so that we change the right one this time. Cool. So that's one way you could start to use that. It looks like it's not the best fit for just 2 different variables, but you could play with it. And again, this is based on like mapping, but it should work for giving you different color schemes that you can work with. Yeah, no problem. We did make it to, we're just 3 minutes out, but any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I'm glad you all stuck around and engaged in the ways that you did. Hope it was helpful. And thanks, I'm John and Nora for all the support. And Brian as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Cody. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you
Well,
very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.